Good evening and welcome. Settle in, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, because tonight I'm going to tell you a story that even Hercule Poirot himself might call extraordinaire. It is London, 1953. The play is called The Debt Unpaid, and tonight is its very last performance, the final bow of a drama that has held the West End spellbound for months. In the audience sits a small, meticulous Belgian gentleman with an extravagant moustache and no intention whatsoever of working. He has come, for once, simply to enjoy himself. But as the curtain falls on the final act, it is not applause that fills the theatre, it is a scream. The leading lady, adored by thousands, lies still upon the stage, and the line between performance and reality has vanished entirely. Was it an accident? A tragic collapse before a packed house? Or did someone in that theatre write a very different ending than the one on the page? Only one man will think to ask. Let the curtain rise. Closing night. The Savoy Theatre, on the night of the 23rd of October, 1953, wore its finest for the occasion. Gilt caught the electric light along the balcony rails, the crush bar was 3 deep in fur stoles and dinner jackets, and somewhere beneath all that polish, ushers moved through the crowd bearing programs still faintly damp with fresh ink. For tonight, and tonight only, the program carried a small black border beneath the title, and the words "Final Performance." Hercule Poirot stood a little apart from the crush, adjusting his cuffs with the particular satisfaction of a man who has, for once, absolutely nothing to detect. "You are certain," he said to his companion, "that I am required to do nothing more strenuous than applaud." Solomon Levy, theatrical solicitor, old friend, and possessor of one of the finest wine cellars in Belgravia, laughed and steered him toward the stairs. "Nothing more strenuous than that, Poirot. I only asked you along because Marguerite specifically requested it. She has read about you in the newspapers and finds you deliciously sinister." "Her words, not mine. Marguerite Deveraux does me a great honor," said Poirot, though his moustaches twitched with the faint suggestion of pleasure. "She is, I am told, magnificent in the role." "She is magnificent in every role," Levy said dryly, "and insufferable in every dressing room. But yes, magnificent. You'll see for yourself." They took their seats in the second box on the left, from which vantage Poirot could survey both the stage and, more usefully, the audience, a habit he had never quite managed to unlearn, even in retirement of an evening. Below them, the stalls filled steadily, critics with their notebooks already open, a scattering of society faces, and in the third row, unmistakable even in profile, a stout man dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief far too often for a night that was not especially warm. "Who is that fellow?" Poirot murmured, "who perspires as though he has already seen the play and did not care for the ending?" Levy followed his gaze. "Archibald Fenwick. He owns the theatre, or rather, the theatre owns him these days, if the rumours are to be believed. Money troubles. This run has kept him afloat rather longer than anyone expected. And tonight it ends." "Tonight it ends," Levy agreed. "And Fenwick loses his golden goose, though I hear he has something else lined up. There's always something else lined up, with men like Fenwick." The house lights dimmed before Poirot could inquire further, and the small orchestra beneath the stage struck up the sombre, deliberate theme that opened The Debt Unpaid, a play, Poirot recalled from the reviews, concerning a family destroyed by a betrayal 30 years old, and the slow, patient revenge finally exacted upon the man responsible. He settled back in his seat, folded his hands over his waistcoat, and allowed himself, for the length of 3 acts, to be merely an audience. It was, he would admit afterward, a very great pleasure while it lasted. Marguerite Deveraux was, without question, magnificent. She entered in the second scene as Eleanor Ashworth, the wrong daughter grown into a woman of terrible patience, and the theatre seemed to lean toward her as one body. She had a voice that could drop to a whisper and still reach the back of the gallery, and eyes that, even at this distance, Poirot fancied he could see calculating something behind every line she spoke. It occurred to him, watching her, that she was not so much acting the part of a woman nursing an old grievance, as she was, perhaps, simply very good at appearing to nurse one. A distinction he noted, and then, being on holiday from his profession, promptly set aside. Opposite her, playing the man she had sworn to destroy, was Julian Rain, tall, silver at the temples in a manner clearly assisted rather than natural, with the kind of handsome, weathered face that photographed well in the society pages. He had, Levy murmured during the interval, been the theatre's leading man for a decade, and had not entirely forgiven the management for casting him, this season, opposite an actress 11 years his junior, who was, by universal agreement, the better performer. "There is history there," Levy said, swirling the interval sherry he had produced from somewhere. Rain and Deveraux. Not the romantic sort, the other sort. He was meant to have the lead in the play before hers was rewritten to be the larger part. He has never quite stopped mentioning it. "The playwright rewrote the play in her favor." "The playwright," said Levy, with the particular relish of a man delivering the best piece of gossip last, "is presently sitting in the front row, looking as though he wishes the theatre would collapse on top of him. Cornelius Wren. Difficult man. Brilliant, mind you, but difficult. This is meant to be his masterpiece, and I understand he has spent the entire run insisting on changes nobody wanted, right up until this week." Poirot glanced down at the front row and observed a thin, ink-stained man of perhaps 50, sitting with his arms folded and his gaze fixed not upon the stage, but upon Marguerite Deveraux specifically, with an expression Poirot found difficult to place, something between admiration and a very old resentment, the two so thoroughly tangled together that a man might mistake one for the other his whole life and never notice the error. The second interval brought more sherry, more names. The understudy, a quiet young woman called Lily Prentice, glimpsed once in the wings adjusting a length of costume with hands that did not quite stay steady. The dresser, an older woman named Ada Grigg, who had, Levy mentioned almost as an afterthought, been with Marguerite Deveraux since the actress's earliest days in provincial repertory, though I gather they've had their differences of late. And Poirot found himself, despite every intention to the contrary, doing what he always did, assembling faces into a small private gallery, filing away a gesture here, a glance there, the way one might press flowers into a book without any particular plan for what to do with them later. "You are working," Levy accused him, not without affection, as the lights dimmed for the final act. "I am merely appreciating the theatre," said Poirot, with dignity. "It is not a crime, mon ami, to notice that people are interesting. With you, it is never merely appreciation." Poirot did not trouble to argue the point, for the curtain was rising on the final act, and Marguerite Deveraux was crossing the stage toward the final confrontation of the play, the scene in which Eleanor Ashworth, 30 years patient, would at last confront the man who had ruined her family, and the debt of the title would finally be called due. It was, Poirot thought, watching her take the small crystal glass from the props table with the particular deliberate care of an actress who had performed this exact gesture some 200 times before, a very well-constructed play. Wren might be difficult, but he understood how to build toward an ending. She raised the glass, a toast, in the scene, to false reconciliation, and drank. And it was only afterward, replaying the moment in the terrible clarity that follows a tragedy, that Poirot would recall the very small thing that struck him as wrong, even as it happened, and that he set aside, in that instant, as nothing at all. She swayed. Julian Rain, opposite her, faltered for half a second, so briefly that most of the audience took it for nothing more than an actor's momentary lapse, easily forgiven on a closing night thick with sentiment. But Poirot, who made a small profession of noticing exactly such things, saw that Rain's eyes had gone, for that half-second, entirely out of character. The eyes of a man watching something go wrong, not a man delivering a line. Marguerite Deveraux completed her final speech. Her voice did not waver. If anything, Poirot thought later, It took on a strange and terrible clarity in its last moments, as though she were reaching for the words through something closing steadily over her. Then, as the closing line was spoken, and the lights began their slow fade to black for the final tableau, she did not simply exit as the stage directions required. She fell. For a full 3 seconds, Poirot would count them later, precisely, in memory, as he counted most things. The audience did not move, because a fall at the close of a tragedy is, after all, exactly what a tragedy requires, and the house was already half risen in anticipation of the ovation. It was Julian Rain's cry, raw, entirely unrehearsed, nothing at all like the practiced anguish of the scene, that told 1,100 people, all at the same moment, that the curtain had come down on something considerably more final than a play. The curtain falls. For a moment, the theatre seemed to hold its breath as one creature, uncertain whether it was witnessing tragedy or its very good imitation. Then the house lights came up too fast, too harsh after the softness of the stage lighting, and 1,100 people saw at once, with the particular cruelty of electric light, that Marguerite Deveraux was not going to rise and take her bow. Poirot! Levy's hand closed on his arm, and there was nothing of the wine merchant left in his voice. Poirot, is she— I do not know, said Poirot, already on his feet. But we shall go and discover it, you and I, rather than sit here wondering. They were not the first to reach the stage. That distinction belonged to Ada Grigg, the dresser, who had come from the wings so fast that one of her shoes had come off in the corridor and lay forgotten behind her, and who was on her knees beside the fallen woman before the curtain had finished its confused, half-lowered descent, someone in the flies having lost their nerve about whether to bring it down or not. Julian Rain knelt on the other side, his stage paint suddenly grotesque under the work-lights, calling her name in a voice that cracked on the second syllable. Poirot made his way down through the pass door with the ease of a man who had, in his time, made his way through a great many pass doors, and arrived at the edge of the small, terrible tableau that had assembled itself where the play's final scene ought to have ended in applause. "Is there a doctor in the house?" someone was calling, uselessly, for it was already apparent to anyone who had seen enough of death, and Poirot had seen a very great deal of it, that no doctor summoned from the stalls would arrive in time to matter. Marguerite Deveraux lay as she had fallen, one arm flung out with the same unconscious grace that had characterized every gesture of her performance, as though even now some final vanity governed the composition of the scene. Her lips had taken on a faint bluish cast at their edges. Her breathing, when Poirot bent to observe it, was audible from a distance no breathing should be audible from. A harsh, dragging effort that stopped as he watched and did not begin again. "Ada," Rain's voice, thick with something between grief and panic. "Ada, do something." "There is nothing to be done, monsieur," said Poirot, gently, but with the particular finality he reserved for moments when kindness required honesty rather than false comfort. "I am sorry. She is gone." The word travelled backward through the small crowd that had gathered in the wings. Stagehands, the assistant stage manager still clutching his cue sheet, the understudy Lily Prentice standing very still in the shadow of a canvas flat with both hands pressed over her mouth, and outward, inevitably, toward the stalls, where it became a rising murmur that would, within the hour, become the substance of 100 telephone calls and a very great many newspaper columns. Poirot knelt beside the body with the small, precise economy of movement that had served him through 40 years of such moments. He did not touch her. That liberty belonged to the police when they arrived, but he observed. The glass she had drunk from during the final scene lay several feet away, having rolled from her hand as she fell, a thin residue of dark liquid still pooled in its base, undisturbed by the fall itself. Had she dropped it while still standing, or set it down deliberately in the choreography of the scene, only for it to be knocked later? He noted the angle of it, the small wet trail it had left across the boards, and the fact, curious, though he could not yet have said why it struck him as curious, that no one, in the chaos of the last several minutes, had thought to move it, kick it, or so much as glance at it. All eyes, understandably, had been upon the woman and not upon the glass. He noted also her hands, one flung wide, the other closed, very slightly, as though in the last moment she had reached for something and found it just beyond her grasp. A small thing, perhaps nothing at all. A dying woman's hand does many things that mean nothing whatsoever. And it was here, in this very first assessment, that Poirot made the misstep he would later think back upon with some private irritation at himself, for he looked at the whole terrible scene, the glass, the collapse coming so swiftly at the end of a long and physically demanding role, the stifling heat of the stage lights, the visible strain that even from his box he had observed in Marguerite Deveraux's face across 3 acts of a taxing performance, and he thought, the heart, perhaps, or the nerves, driven too far by a role too demanding, on a night too significant. It was, after all, hardly unheard of. Actresses had collapsed from exhaustion, and worse, under far less strain than a closing night before a packed and critical house. He filed the glass away as a small curiosity rather than a certainty, told himself he was on holiday and it was not, in any case, his theatre to investigate, and rose to his feet with the private, comfortable conclusion that here was a tragedy of the body and not of malice. It was a conclusion he would abandon within the half-hour, and one he would think of, every time thereafter that this case came to mind, as proof that even his own little grey cells could, upon occasion, take the path of least resistance when a glass of sherry and a pleasant evening had made a man reluctant to see what stood before him. "Everyone must stay precisely where they are," he said instead, straightening his waistcoat and raising his voice with sufficient authority that the milling stagehands actually paused. "The police will wish to speak to all who were upon this stage, or near to it. Monsieur Rain, I am very sorry, but you must step back now and let no one touch the glass upon the floor there." "The glass?" Rain looked at him as though Poirot had suggested something obscene. "What in God's name does the glass matter? She's dead." "Yes, monsieur," said Poirot quietly. "And that is precisely why, until we know how, we touch nothing at all." It was Fenwick, the theatre's owner, who arrived next through the past door, still mopping at his forehead, though the theatre had grown, if anything, rather cold in the last several minutes. Grief, or something else, Poirot noted, produces its own peculiar sweat. And it was Fenwick who had the presence of mind, whatever his other qualities, to telephone at once for the police, rather than simply the doctor, a decision that told Poirot something about the man's character, though he could not yet have said precisely what. Cornelius Wren came more slowly, drawn from the front row as though wading through water, and stood at the edge of the stage looking down at the woman who had, by every account, made his play a triumph, with an expression Poirot found genuinely difficult to read. Not the shock of the others, quite, but something closer to a man watching the final act of a story he had, in some sense, already written. The house, meanwhile, had begun its slow, reluctant evacuation, ushers moving through rows of stunned patrons who did not entirely wish to leave, as though staying might somehow unhappen what they had just witnessed. Levy remained at Poirot's shoulder, uncharacteristically silent, until the last of the audience had gone, and only the company remained, scattered about the stage and wings like pieces abandoned mid-game. "You don't think," Levy said quietly, "that this was simply—" "I think, mon ami," said Poirot, watching the glass still lying untouched upon the boards, its small dark residue catching the worklights, "that I have been enjoying myself a great deal this evening, and that this has perhaps made me a fool for the first 10 minutes of a tragedy. But I do not think it any longer, and when the police arrive, I believe I shall find that I am rather more interested in their investigation than I had planned to be." Somewhere beyond the wings, a telephone was ringing, and no one yet had thought to answer it. A favour for a friend. The police arrived within the quarter hour, in the person of a detective inspector named Japp, no relation, Poirot noted with private amusement, to his old friend at Scotland Yard, though the coincidence of the name struck him as the sort of small joke the universe occasionally permitted itself. This Japp was younger, leaner, with the harried look of a man who had been called from his supper and had not yet forgiven the evening for it, and he regarded the assembled company of the Debt Unpaid with the particular suspicion policemen reserve for anyone whose profession involves the convincing performance of emotions they do not feel. "Right," he said, surveying the stage as though it were a crime scene that had been inconveniently dressed as a Victorian drawing room, which in a sense it had. "Nobody leaves the building. I want names, addresses, and I want to know exactly where everyone was standing when this happened." His eye fell on Poirot, still standing sentinel over the untouched glass. "And who might you be, sir?" "Hercule Poirot, Inspector. I had the very great misfortune to be a guest in the audience this evening, and the somewhat smaller misfortune of being the first upon the stage." The name did what names of that particular kind generally did to policemen of a certain age, produced a visible recalibration behind the eyes, a swift mental filing of nuisance into the adjacent and more useful category of possibly useful nuisance. "The detective," Japp said. "I've read about you. Retired, aren't you?" "Entirely," Poirot agreed, with a modesty he did not especially feel. "I came this evening only to admire Mademoiselle Deveraux's performance, which I did, very much, right up until the moment it became something other than a performance." "I would not dream of intruding upon your investigation, Inspector, except to observe that the glass upon the floor there has not been touched by anyone since it fell, and that this may prove of some interest to your surgeon." Japp's gaze moved to the glass, and something in his expression suggested he had, until that moment, been prepared to treat the evening as a straightforward matter of a delicate constitution and an exhausting role. "You think she was poisoned?" "I think," said Poirot carefully, "that I do not yet think anything at all, Inspector, beyond the observation that a woman does not customarily die within moments of drinking from a glass, and leave that glass entirely unremarked upon by a company of professional actors who spend their working lives noticing precisely such details. That alone I find worth your attention, though it is, of course, entirely your investigation and not mine." It was Solomon Levy, ever the solicitor, ever alert to the moment a useful connection might be forged, who supplied the final push. "Inspector, if I might say so, you would be a fool not to make use of him while he's standing here." "Half of Scotland Yard would give a month's pay for the privilege." Japp regarded Poirot for a long moment, the reluctance of a proud man weighing itself against the plain arithmetic of expediency, and at last produced, from somewhere beneath the harassment of the evening, the ghost of a professional courtesy. "I can't have you running my investigation, Mr. Poirot, but I won't pretend I couldn't use another pair of eyes tonight, given half this company will have gone home and rehearsed their stories by morning. Consider yourself, unofficial, purely as a favour." "A favour," Poirot agreed, with the private satisfaction of a man who had got precisely what he wanted while appearing to have wanted nothing at all. "Purely that, Inspector." The police surgeon arrived within the half-hour, a brisk, unsentimental man named Caro, who knelt beside the body with the particular efficiency of one who has attended a great many sudden deaths in a great many undignified locations, and long ago stopped finding the theatre of it interesting. He examined Marguerite Deveraux's hands, her lips, the faint discoloration already visible at her fingertips, and after some minutes rose, wiping his hands on a cloth produced from his bag. "Can't say for certain until the post-mortem, but I'll tell you now, Inspector, this wasn't her heart, and it wasn't exhaustion. The cyanosis, the speed of it, the rigidity already setting into the jaw. I've seen this before, and I don't like where it points." "Poison," said Japp flatly. "I'd stake my pension on it. Something fast-acting, something that hit the nervous system hard. I'll know more once I've had her on the table, but I wouldn't be looking at natural causes if I were you." Poirot, who had been listening with his head tilted very slightly, as was his habit when a fact was arranging itself into position among several others, asked quietly, "The glass, Doctor, would such a substance be detectable there if it had been introduced to the drink she took upon the stage?" Caro glanced toward the glass, still sitting where it had fallen, now finally photographed and about to be bagged by a young constable with the careful reverence of a man handling something he suspected might be extremely important to his career. If it's in the glass, we'll find it. If it's not, well, then we'll have to look a good deal further than a prop table, won't we? This last observation Poirot found himself turning over with particular interest, for it had not, until that moment, fully occurred to him that the poison, if poison it was, might not have travelled by so simple and obvious a route as the glass at all. A play, after all, was a construction of many small mechanical parts. Costumes, props, gestures rehearsed 200 times until they became invisible even to those performing them. And any one of those parts might, in principle, be made to carry something other than what the audience believed it carried. "Inspector," he said, "I wonder if I might examine the stage itself and the props table before too many hands have had the opportunity to disturb what remains of tonight's arrangement." Jap, occupied with directing a constable toward the taking of names in the wings, waved a distracted permission, and Poirot moved with unhurried purpose toward the small table set just off the prompt side of the stage, where the properties for the final act had been laid out with the neat, habitual precision of a stage management long accustomed to closing night nerves. A decanter half full of what proved, on a cautious sniff, to be nothing more sinister than cold tea dressed up under the lights as brandy. The theatre's usual economy with real spirits, Poirot suspected. A second glass, twin to the one already bagged, standing empty and unused, for the scene had required only the one drink, taken by Eleanor Ashworth alone. A small pewter box, its lid faintly warm still from the stage lights, containing a folded letter, a prop letter, its contents nothing more than blank paper folded to resemble correspondence, as such props so often were, since no audience ever reads what an actor merely holds. And beside the props table, tucked half behind a canvas flat, where it would not be visible to the audience but would be entirely within reach of an actor exiting into the wings, a small enamel jug, of the kind used for topping up decanters between performances, its neck still faintly damp. Poirot lifted it with great care, using his handkerchief rather than his fingers, and held it to his nose. Nothing but water, or so it seemed to his own untrained sense, which he trusted for a great many things but not, he reminded himself, for the subtler chemistries of poison, which required a laboratory and not a moustache, however magnificent. "You there," he said to a passing stagehand, a thin, anxious young man clutching a clipboard as though it might protect him from the general catastrophe of the evening. "Who is responsible for the filling of this jug, and for the arrangement of this table before each performance?" That's Ada's job, sir. Mrs. Grigg. She dresses Miss Deveraux, but she sees to the props for the final act too, on account of Miss Deveraux liked things done a particular way and didn't trust anyone else with it." "I see," said Poirot, and set the jug down again, very precisely, in exactly the spot from which he had lifted it. "And has Mrs. Grigg been with this company long?" "Years, sir. Longer than anyone. She came up with Miss Deveraux from the old days, before she was anybody at all." Poirot thanked the young man and stood for a moment surveying the stage as a whole. The props table, the glass now bagged and gone, the space in the wings where an actress might pass unseen for perhaps 3 or 4 seconds between one line and the next. Long enough, he thought, for a great many small and terrible things to be accomplished by a hand that knew exactly where to reach. Behind him, Jap was moving methodically through the company, taking names in a notebook already half filled with the particular shorthand of a policeman who has learned not to trust first impressions, but must, nonetheless, begin somewhere. A favour for a friend, Poirot thought, watching Ada Grigg being led gently toward a chair in the wings by a young constable, her face grey, and her hands, he noticed, trembling rather more than grief alone, generally produced in a woman who had dressed actresses through 40 years of theatrical crises, far smaller than this one. That is what I told myself this would be. But I think, before this night is out, it will be considerably more than that. He drew out his notebook, the small, precise one he carried always, from habit rather than present necessity, or so he had believed until an hour ago, and began, in his neat continental hand, to write down everything he had observed, beginning with the small, wrong thing he had noticed and dismissed, and had no further intention of dismissing again. Behind the velvet. The dressing rooms of the Savoy lay along a narrow corridor beneath the stage, reached by a staircase so steep and so poorly lit that Poirot found himself grateful for the handrail, worn smooth by 40 years of actors' hands hurrying up and down it between cues. Japp had granted him, with the air of a man who suspected he would regret it, permission to conduct what the inspector insisted on calling a preliminary conversation with members of the company, while the official interviews proceeded upstairs in the manager's office. It was, Poirot reflected, a very generous definition of unofficial, and he had no intention of correcting it. Ada Grigg's small room. She shared none of the grandeur of the Star's dressing room next door, only a narrow space crowded with sewing baskets and pressed costumes hung with military precision, smelled of grease paint and lavender water, and the woman herself sat very upright in its single chair, hands folded in her lap, in the manner of someone determined not to let them shake where others could see. "Madame Grigg," Poirot said gently, settling himself on the room's second chair, a low stool clearly intended for costume fittings rather than conversation, so that he found himself sitting rather lower than his companion, a position he did not entirely mind, for it made him appear smaller and less alarming, and grief, he had long ago learned, spoke more freely to what it did not fear. "I am told you have known Mademoiselle Deveraux a very long time, since she was nobody at all," Ada said, and her voice, though steady, carried an edge that had nothing to do with performance. "Manchester Rep, 1928. She was 17, and I was her dresser even then, though God knows there wasn't much to dress. 2 costumes and a coat with the lining gone. I watched her become what she became, Mr. Poirot. Every inch of it. That is a very great deal of history to carry. It is." She looked at her hands. "And a very great deal of history means a very great deal of everything, sir. The good and the rest of it." "The rest of it," Poirot echoed, with the particular gentleness he reserved for the moment just before a witness decided whether to trust him. "You will forgive me, madam, but I have heard it said that you and Mademoiselle had, of late, your differences." Something moved behind Ada Grigg's eyes. Not surprise, precisely, more the weary recognition of a woman who had known the question was coming, and had simply hoped it might come from someone she liked better. "She dismissed my niece from the company 2 months back. Wardrobe assistant, my sister's girl, barely 19. Marguerite said she was clumsy with the pins, and wanted her gone, and gone she went, and no amount of me asking would change her mind, though I'd given that woman 30 years. Her jaw tightened. "I won't pretend I forgave her for it easily, but I didn't kill her for it, Mr. Poirot, whatever you're thinking behind that very polite face of yours." "I think nothing so simple as that, madame," Poirot said truthfully. "I think only that you filled the jug behind the props table before tonight's performance, as you have done for every performance of this run, and that you are perhaps the person best placed, of anyone in this theatre, to tell me whether anything about that table was different tonight from any other night." For the first time, Ada Grigg's composure genuinely wavered. "I've asked myself that same question every minute since it happened, sir, and I can't swear to an answer. I filled the jug at 6:30, same as always. The glasses were set out, same as always. I can't say what happened to them after I left that table, because a dozen people crossed that stage between 6:30 and the curtain going up, and I can't account for every one of them." "A dozen people," Poirot repeated. "You will give me their names, perhaps, before I leave you this evening. But first, one further question, and I ask it only because it troubles me, and I think you may be able to set it at rest. The niece who was dismissed, where is she now?" "Gone to her mother's, in Croydon, weeks ago. Nowhere near this theatre tonight, if that's what you're asking, and you can check it easy enough. My sister will vouch for her." "I do not doubt it," said Poirot, and meant it, for a grievance 2 months cold and a dismissed girl in Croydon sat uneasily beside the very immediate, very intimate knowledge that whoever had reached that props table had known exactly which glass, exactly which moment, exactly which small, unwatched gap in the choreography of the evening to use. It was not, he thought, the crime of someone acting at a distance through a wronged relation. It was the crime of someone who belonged to this theatre as thoroughly as the boards beneath its stage. He thanked Ada Grigg, noted the names she gave him with visible reluctance. The stage manager, 2 scene shifters, Julian Rain, Lily Prentice, Cornelius Wren himself, who had apparently taken to pacing the wings during the final act, on nights when a scene troubled him, and made his way to the door at the end of the corridor, upon which a small, tarnished star still bore the name Miss M. Deveraux, now guarded by a young constable, who let him pass only after some minutes of increasingly circular negotiation regarding the precise boundaries of unofficial. The room was as its occupant had left it, mirror-ringed with electric bulbs, 3 of them burnt out and never replaced, a dressing table crowded with pots and brushes, and a great many unopened telegrams of congratulation for a closing night that had never come to be celebrated. Poirot moved through it slowly, touching nothing, reading everything, in the manner that had served him for so many years, in so many such rooms. It was Lily Prentice he found waiting outside, when at last he emerged, a slight, fair young woman, still half in her understudy's costume, twisting a handkerchief between fingers that had clearly been twisting it for some time. "They said I might speak to you," she said, before he had properly greeted her. "The policeman, Inspector Japp, he's very busy with Mr. Rain just now, and I thought perhaps I ought to say this to someone before I lose my nerve to say it at all." "Then you must certainly say it to me, mademoiselle," said Poirot, with the particular stillness he adopted when he sensed a witness balanced upon the edge of a confession, "before your nerve, as you say, deserts you." She glanced up and down the corridor and lowered her voice. "I was to go on for her, Mr. Poirot. Next week." Marguerite was leaving the production, leaving the stage altogether, some said, though she'd told no one why, only that tonight was to be her very last performance, regardless of what the posters said about the play closing. I was to take over the role in the transfer to New York. Everyone in this company knows it. Everyone in this company also knows that I have wanted that part since the day I was cast as her understudy, and I won't insult you by pretending otherwise, because you'd see through it in a moment, and then you'd trust nothing else I told you. Poirot regarded her for a long moment. The honesty of the admission, offered before he had asked for it, weighed as heavily in her favour as the admission itself weighed against her, and he had learned, across 40 years, to be considerably more suspicious of witnesses who volunteered nothing than of witnesses who volunteered too much. "That is a very candid thing to tell a man investigating a murder, mademoiselle. It's a very candid thing to have to tell anyone," Lily said, and for a moment the handkerchief in her hands stilled entirely. "But I'd rather you heard it from me than heard it whispered by someone in this company who'd make it sound a great deal worse than it is. I wanted the part, Mr. Poirot. I did not want her dead to get it. There is a very great difference between those two things, and I hope, before this is over, you'll see it as clearly as I do." "I hope so also, mademoiselle," said Poirot gently, and made a small, precise note in the book he carried, beneath which he wrote, in letters smaller than the rest, "The desire for a thing and the willingness to take it are not the same appetite, though they are cousins, and cousins, upon occasion, do resemble one another closely enough to be mistaken." The rival and the rewrite. Julian Rain received Poirot in his dressing room, still half in costume, the silver at his temples now betrayed under the harsh bulbs, as the artifice Levy had promised, his stage paint wiped away in streaks that left his face looking older and considerably less certain of itself than it had appeared across the footlights an hour before. "I've already told the inspector everything I know," he said, not rising from his chair, "which is precisely nothing, Mr. Poirot, beyond the fact that I watched a woman I have shared a stage with for 3 years die in front of 1,100 people, and that I do not particularly wish to relive it a second time for the benefit of a private detective, however distinguished." "I understand entirely, monsieur, and I would not ask it of you were it not necessary," said Poirot, settling himself without invitation, for he had found long ago that the request for permission, in such moments, only granted the witness an opportunity to refuse it. I wish only to ask you of the moment itself, the half-second, no more, in which your face betrayed something the rest of the audience did not see. You knew, before she fell, that something was wrong. Rain's hand, reaching for a cloth to remove the last of his paint, stilled. That's a very particular thing to have noticed, from a box on the second tier. It is my profession to notice particular things, monsieur, even when I am, as I believed myself to be this evening, merely a member of the audience. For a long moment Rain said nothing, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost the practiced smoothness of the stage entirely. She missed her mark. Small thing, an inch, perhaps two, on the turn before the final line. Marguerite never missed her mark, Mr. Poirot, not once in 300 performances, and I knew in that instant, the way you know a note is wrong before you can say why, that something was happening to her that had nothing to do with the play at all. I very nearly broke character. I have wondered since whether I ought to have simply stopped the performance. You could not have saved her, monsieur, whatever you had done in that moment. The doctor is quite certain. The substance, whatever it proves to be, acted with great speed. That is meant to comfort me, I suppose. Rain set down the cloth. It doesn't, particularly. Poirot allowed a small silence to settle. The kind he had learned did more work than any question, and into it Rain said, unprompted, with the air of a man who had been rehearsing the confession privately for the better part of an hour, and had decided, finally, to deliver it. You'll hear soon enough that I resented her, so I would rather you heard the truth of it from me. I was meant to have the larger role in this play. Wren wrote it that way originally. Ashworth the son, not the daughter, the revenge plot centered on him, not her. Marguerite came to a reading 18 months ago, and by the end of the week, Wren had rewritten half the second act to give her the part instead, and I was left playing the man she destroys. I have played the man she destroys for 18 months, Mr. Poirot. 400 performances of watching another actor take the ending I was promised, and I will not pretend to you that it has not eaten at me. But I did not kill her for it. I am a vain man, and a bitter one of late, but I am not that. Vanity and bitterness, said Poirot mildly, have accounted for a very great many murders in my experience, monsieur, though I do not say that either accounts for this one. Tell me, you say Monsieur Wren rewrote the play in her favour. Was he, in your observation, entirely content to have done so? Something flickered across Rain's face, the first genuine surprise Poirot had provoked from him. Content? I've never known Wren to be content with anything, least of all his own work. But if you're asking whether he regretted the rewrite, no, I don't think that's the word. There was something else between them, something older than this production. I never learned what. Marguerite could silence a room simply by looking at Cornelius Wren in a certain way, and he let her do it, which is not a thing that man permits from anyone else alive. Poirot found Cornelius Wren where the young stagehand had suggested he might, not in a dressing room, but on the empty stage itself, standing at the precise spot where Marguerite Deveraux had fallen, now marked only by a faint chalked outline the police had left behind, staring down at it with his hands thrust deep in his coat pockets, and an expression Poirot could only describe, privately, as a man reading the final page of his own manuscript, for the first time, and finding it had ended nothing at all as he had planned. Monsieur Wren, you're the detective. Wren did not look up, the one Fenwick's solicitor dragged along for the evening's entertainment. I had hoped, said Poirot, coming to stand beside him, for rather less entertainment than the evening in fact provided. That drew a short, humourless breath that might, in a kinder mood, have been a laugh. I wrote this play, Mr. Poirot, every line of it. Do you know what it's about? A debt 30 years old, I am told, and the very patient revenge exacted at last upon the man who incurred it. Very good. Word perfect, in fact. You might have read the programme notes. Wren finally turned to look at him, and his eyes, Poirot thought, held something that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with a much older exhaustion. I wrote a play about revenge served cold, Mr. Poirot, and tonight, on its very last performance, someone served me a revenge of their own, in my own theatre. using my own play as the stage for it. Do you understand what an appalling piece of construction that is? I could not have plotted it better myself, and believe me, I have plotted a great many endings in my time." "You speak," said Poirot carefully, "as though you believe this murder was committed with some particular meaning attached to it, that the manner and the moment were chosen deliberately to echo your play. Don't you?" Wren looked at him properly for the first time. "A woman poisoned during the very scene in which her character collects a debt 30 years overdue. Mr. Poirot, I have spent 11 months of my life on this play, and I promise you, no coincidence in the theatre is ever quite so elegant as it first appears. Someone wanted this death to mean something. I should very much like to know what, and to whom." "As would I, monsieur," said Poirot, and found, for the first time that evening, that he entirely agreed with the playwright's instinct, whatever else he thought of the man's evasions. For Wren had said it plainly, there was something else between them, something older than this production, and it seemed to Poirot that a man who wrote so precisely about old debts might, himself, be carrying one. "Tell me, Monsieur Wren," he said, watching the playwright's face with care, "how long, precisely, have you known Mademoiselle Deveraux?" The silence that followed lasted a fraction too long to be entirely comfortable, and Poirot noted it, as he noted everything, in the small private ledger he was assembling of the evening's debts still owed. Money and motive. Wren did not answer at once, and when he did, it was with the careful economy of a man selecting each word as though it might later be produced in evidence. "Longer than this production, if that's what you're asking. We were young together, in a manner of speaking. I wrote her first decent part, in a little theatre in Islington that no longer exists, some 15 years ago. That is the whole of it, Mr. Poirot, and I would thank you not to make more of it than there is." "I make of it only what you have told me, monsieur," said Poirot mildly, "which is a great deal more than nothing, and considerably less, I think, than everything. But I will not press you tonight. Grief does not always answer honestly, even when it means to." He left Wren standing over the chalk outline and made his way up through the past door to where, in the manager's office, Archibald Fenwick sat waiting his turn with Inspector Japp, still mopping at a brow that had not, so far as Poirot could determine, stopped perspiring since the curtain first rose that evening. Japp, catching sight of Poirot in the doorway, waved him in with the weary permission of a man who had decided, somewhere in the last hour, that resistance was more exhausting than cooperation. "Mr. Fenwick was just telling me," Japp said, with the flat delivery of a policeman setting a trap and inviting his witness to walk into it a second time, "about the theatre's finances." "Perhaps you'd like to hear it again, Mr. Poirot, seeing as you're so keen on details." Fenwick's hand, holding the handkerchief, did not quite still, but his voice, when he spoke, had the practiced smoothness of a man who had explained away worse than this before. "There's no mystery in it, Inspector. This run kept the Savoy solvent through a difficult 2 years. I won't pretend otherwise. Everyone in the business knows it. Marguerite Deveraux's name on the marquee sold tickets that nothing else I've staged in a decade could touch. Her leaving the production was going to be a considerable blow, yes. But her dying in the middle of my theatre, in front of the entire press, is a very great deal worse than a blow, gentlemen, whatever you may be thinking. I lose my leading lady either way. The manner of losing her has cost me a great deal more than her contract ever would have." "And yet," said Poirot gently, taking the chair beside the desk without waiting to be asked, "I am told you had something else lined up, monsieur. Those were the words used to me earlier this evening, before I knew to attach any significance to them. Perhaps you would tell us what." Something crossed Fenwick's face, not quite alarm, but the particular discomfort of a man whose private arrangements had arrived rather sooner into the conversation than he had hoped. "A transfer. New York. I'd been in negotiation for months to take the production across, with Deveraux in the lead, naturally. The Americans have been mad for her since the film came out 2 years back. It would have made this theatre's fortune twice over. And Mademoiselle Deveraux had agreed to this transfer?" "She had not," said Fenwick, and here, for the first time, the handkerchief stilled entirely in his hand. That's the difficulty of it, Mr. Poirot, and I don't mind telling you, since I expect you'd dig it up regardless. She informed me 3 weeks ago that she intended to leave the stage altogether after tonight. No transfer, no New York, no further contracts of any kind. She would not say why, only that her decision was final, and I had rather a great deal riding on that transfer not being cancelled. That is, Poirot observed, a very considerable motive, monsieur, for wishing Mademoiselle Deveraux had never made that decision at all. It is, Fenwick agreed, with a bluntness that Poirot found, on balance, more persuasive than any protestation of innocence could have been. I won't insult either of you by pretending otherwise, but a dead leading lady serves my interests a great deal less than a living one who simply changed her mind might have. I had every reason to want her persuaded, Mr. Poirot, and none whatsoever to want her silenced. Dead, she's worth nothing to me but scandal, and scandal, whatever the newspapers may believe, does not pay a theatre's debts. It was, Poirot reflected, watching the man's evident discomfort resolve itself into something closer to relief at having finally said the worst of it aloud. A reasonably sound piece of logic, and one that a guilty man might equally have constructed in advance for precisely this conversation. He made a note of it nonetheless, and turned the matter over as he left Fenwick to Japp's further questions and made his way back down toward the stage, where the last of the company were being permitted, at last, to gather their belongings and depart into the small hours of a London already forgetting, in its sleep, that anything at all had happened at the Savoy that night. It was in the wings, some minutes later, that a discovery arrived which would require Poirot to revisit rather more than Fenwick's finances. A young constable, going methodically through the pockets of the costumes hung along the corridor below stage, a task Japp had ordered more from procedure than any particular hope of result, called out from Ada Grigg's small domain. And Poirot arrived to find him holding, with the careful reverence of evidence rather than costume, a small glass phial, entirely empty, tucked into the lining of the coat Marguerite Deveraux had worn in the play's second act, and discarded, according to the script, a full 20 minutes before the scene in which she died. "In the second act coat, sir," the constable said. "Not the one she died in, this one." Poirot took it, turning it in his handkerchief, and felt the small, precise satisfaction of a fact refusing to sit where he had placed it. He had assumed, as he suspected, had everyone in the theatre that night, Japp included, that whatever substance had killed Marguerite Deveraux had travelled to her by the shortest and most obvious route, the glass, drunk in the final scene, filled from the jug Ada Grigg had prepared at 6:30. A single point of poisoning, a single window of opportunity, a single question of who had passed the props table in the crucial hour before curtain. But an empty phial in a coat discarded 20 minutes before death complicated that picture considerably, for it suggested either that the poison had been administered a good deal earlier than anyone had assumed, perhaps not in the final glass at all, but absorbed slowly across the last act by some other means, a scent, a residue on the skin from handling the coat, a slower agent than Caro's brisk assessment had allowed for, or, more troublingly still, that someone had gone to considerable trouble to plant a false trail precisely where an investigator, having found the coat, might be tempted to conclude the whole matter settled and look no further. "You did not think, monsieur," Poirot murmured to himself, turning the empty phial once more in the light, "that I would be quite so easily persuaded as that." He thought of his own conclusion, so confidently reached and so quickly abandoned, in the first minutes after the fall, the heart, perhaps, or the nerves, driven too far, and felt, not for the first time that night, the small private discomfort of a man who prided himself on seeing clearly, and had, for the length of one careless quarter-hour, seen exactly what a well-constructed scene had wished him to see. A phial in the wrong coat was either carelessness of a very ordinary kind, or it was theatre, a piece of staging every bit as deliberate as anything Cornelius Wren had written into his script, and Poirot found, standing in that narrow corridor with the smell of grease paint still thick in the air, that he no longer believed, even slightly, in the ordinary kind. The Little Grey Cells. Poirot did not sleep that night, though he returned briefly to his hotel at Levy's insistence, and sat instead in the wing chair by his window with his notebook open upon his knee and the small, precise pieces of the evening arranged before his mind's eye as though laid out upon a table. A glass, a jug, a phial in the wrong coat, a rewritten play, a cancelled transfer, a dismissed niece, a woman who had decided, 3 weeks before her death, to leave the stage forever, and had told no one why. Why, he thought, tapping his pencil against the notebook's edge, does a woman at the very height of her celebrity, adored, sought after by producers on 2 continents, choose to abandon it all? And choose, moreover, to say nothing of her reasons to the man whose fortune depended upon her staying. It was Caro's telephone call, reaching him at his hotel a little after 9 the following morning, that supplied the first piece he had genuinely lacked. "Post-mortem's done, Mr. Poirot. You'll want to hear this before you hear it from Jap second-hand. The poison was aconitine, monkshood in the common tongue. Fast-acting, exactly as I suspected, and it was in the glass all right, plenty of it. But here's your puzzle. There was a second substance in her system entirely unconnected to the poisoning. Traces of a sedative, chloral, in a mild dose administered some hours before death, likely with her supper or her evening tea. Nothing fatal in itself. Nothing anyone would have taken any particular notice of in a woman known to suffer nerves before a performance. A sedative, Poirot repeated slowly, taken hours before the poison that killed her, and entirely unnecessary to the murder itself, since the aconitine in the glass was, you tell me, more than sufficient on its own. That's about the size of it. Odd little detail. Might mean nothing. Plenty of actresses dose themselves before a difficult night." "It might mean nothing," Poirot agreed, though even as he said it he did not believe it, for in his long experience, the detail that appeared to mean nothing was very often the one detail the murderer had not intended to leave behind at all. An accident of arrangement, a stitch out of place in an otherwise seamless piece of theatre. He thanked Caro and sat for some time after ringing off, turning the sedative over in his mind beside the phial found in the wrong coat, and felt, quite suddenly, the shape of something that had been eluding him since the previous evening begin, at last, to resolve itself into an outline he recognized. 2 substances, he thought. One administered hours before the performance, mild, harmless in itself, a sedative such as one might give to calm nerves, or such as one might give to ensure that a person slept deeply and did not stir when a phial was slipped into the lining of a coat hanging, unwatched, in an empty dressing room. And the second, the fatal dose, delivered not by whoever handled that coat at all, but by whoever had access to the glass in the final scene, which is to say, by whoever filled the jug at 6:30, or by whoever passed the props table unobserved in the hour that followed. 2 hands, perhaps. Or 1 hand, twice. Once to prepare the ground, unseen, hours before the curtain, and once again to strike, in the last moments before the final scene. He returned to the Savoy a little before noon, where Jap had established a temporary headquarters in Fenwick's own office, and was, by the look of the papers scattered across the desk, making rather less progress than his mood suggested he would have liked. "Company's story checks out, more or less," Jap said, without preamble, waving Poirot to a chair. "Grigg filled the jug at 6:30, same as any night. 6 people crossed that stage between then and curtain. Scene shifters, the stage manager checking marks, Rain going over a line with Wren. Any one of them could have put something in that glass, and none of them noticed a thing, because none of them had any reason to be watching a prop nobody thought mattered yet. It's a bloody sieve, Mr. Poirot, and I don't mind telling you I'm no further forward than I was at midnight. I think, Inspector, that we have perhaps been asking the wrong question of the evidence, Poirot said, settling himself and folding his hands. We have asked ourselves who had the opportunity to reach the glass in that single crucial hour, and the answer, as you say, is very nearly everyone. But I think the crime was not committed in that hour at all, or rather, that the hour was only the final small act of a murder that began a good deal earlier, and required, for its success, that Mademoiselle Deveraux be made calm and quiet, and unlikely to notice a small interference with her things, some hours before the curtain ever rose. He laid out Caro's finding of the sedative and watched Japp's frown deepen into something more thoughtful. "You're saying someone drugged her early, so she wouldn't notice the phial being planted, or wouldn't be sharp enough to taste something wrong in that final glass?" "I am saying, Inspector, that this required a person with two very particular kinds of access. Access to Mademoiselle Deveraux's food or drink hours before the performance, when she was in her dressing room, resting, perhaps taking tea brought to her by someone she trusted absolutely and would not think to question, and access later to the props table and the glass, at some point during that crucial hour before curtain. It is possible these were two different people, working, whether knowingly or not, toward the same end. But I confess I find it a great deal more elegant, and murder, Inspector, in my experience, is very often a great deal more elegant than we give it credit for, to imagine a single person possessed of both opportunities. "Who in this company," Japp said slowly, "brings her tea, has the run of her dressing room for hours before curtain, and has a reason to be near that props table at 6:30? Poirot did not answer at once. Instead, he opened his notebook to the page on which he had recorded, the previous evening, Ada Grigg's own words, "I filled the jug at 6:30, same as always," and beside them, in his own hand, the observation the dresser herself had volunteered, unprompted, in that first interview below stage. "She dismissed my niece from the company 2 months back. I won't pretend I forgave her for it easily." And beneath that, written later, after the discovery of the phial, a dresser sees to a woman's tea, her costumes, her dressing room, for years, for decades, with a devotion that looks, from the outside, exactly like love, and is perhaps, in the end, something considerably more complicated than love alone. "I think, Inspector," Poirot said slowly, "that we have been looking for a motive large enough to justify so calculated a crime. Money, ambition, a stolen role, a rewritten play, when the motive we require may be a good deal older and a good deal smaller than any of these. A grievance nursed not for weeks, but for years. A woman who gave her whole working life to another woman's career and was repaid, at the end of it, with the dismissal of a beloved niece over a matter of clumsy pins. That's thin, Poirot. Devoted service and one sacked relative doesn't make a poisoner." "No," Poirot agreed, "it does not. Which is why, Inspector, before we go further, I think we must ask Madame Grigg one question we have not yet thought to ask her. Not where she was at 6:30, which she has already told us, but what, precisely, Mademoiselle Deveraux discovered, or threatened to discover, in the weeks before her death, that made her decide, quite suddenly and without explanation to anyone, that she could no longer bear to remain upon the stage at all." "You think Deveraux found something out about Grigg?" "I think," said Poirot, rising, "that a woman does not abandon the height of her profession, in silence, without a reason of very great weight indeed, and I think, Inspector, that it is time we discovered whether that reason and this murder are, as I begin to suspect, one and the same thing wearing two different faces." The final curtain. By the following evening, the Savoy stood dark for the first time in 11 months. No queue at the box office, no programs in the lobby, only a single police constable at the stage door, and, within, the small company of the Debt Unpaid, gathered once more upon the stage, where their play had ended so much sooner than any of them had rehearsed. Japp had agreed, with visible reluctance and the private curiosity of a man who suspected he was about to learn something he would rather have discovered for himself, to let Poirot conduct the evening as he wished. They sat where Poirot had arranged them, Fenwick mopping still, though the theatre was cold, Julian Rain with his arms folded, watchful, Lily Prentice very pale beside Ada Grigg, who held the younger woman's hand, as though it were she who needed comforting, rather than the reverse, and Cornelius Wren, seated a little apart from the others, exactly as he had stood the night before, at the edge of the stage, looking down at a chalk outline that had since been washed away. "I owe you all an apology," Poirot began, standing in the very centre of the set that had, 2 nights before, staged Eleanor Ashworth's revenge, though not, I think, the apology any of you expect. When Mademoiselle Deveraux fell, my very first thought, the thought of a man who had drunk a pleasant sherry and wished only to enjoy his evening, was that her heart had simply failed her, driven too hard by a demanding role on a night of great significance. It was a comfortable thought, and it was wrong, and I set it aside within minutes. I tell you this not to excuse myself, but because I have learned, across many years, that the comfortable answer is very often exactly the answer a clever murderer hopes an investigator will reach for first. "Get on with it, Poirot," Japp murmured, though not unkindly. "I shall." Mademoiselle Deveraux died of aconitine, placed in the glass she drank from in the final scene, a poison fast, certain and requiring only a moment's access to a table that a dozen people crossed in the hour before curtain. That much Inspector Japp's excellent officers established for us within a day. But a second discovery troubled me a great deal more. An empty phial, found not in the coat she wore when she died, but in the coat discarded 20 minutes earlier, and a sedative in her blood, administered hours before the curtain rose, by someone she trusted enough to take a cup of tea from their hand without question. His gaze moved, deliberately, to Ada Grigg, and he watched the dresser's face tighten with the particular fear of a woman who has spent a lifetime being suspected of things she did not do. "I confess, madame, that for some hours I believed the case against you very nearly complete. You alone filled the jug each evening. You alone had cause for grievance in the matter of your niece. You alone had brought Mademoiselle Deveraux her tea without fail for 30 years, and would have done so again on the night she died without anyone in this theatre thinking twice of it." "I never," Ada began, her voice cracking. "No, madame, you never," Poirot agreed gently. "For there was one detail that would not sit quietly where I had placed it, however I arranged it. You told me yourself, on the night of the murder, that you had asked yourself every minute since whether anything about that props table had been different. A guilty woman, madame, does not spend her first hours of freedom asking herself questions she already knows the answer to. She spends them constructing an answer for others. You gave me instead the honest confusion of a woman genuinely searching her own memory, and that, I think, is not a thing that can be performed, even by the finest actress in London, and you, madame, are not an actress at all." He turned, and the stage seemed, for a moment, to hold its breath as it had held it 2 nights before. The tea that carried the sedative was not brought to Mademoiselle Deveraux by her dresser that afternoon, but by an old friend, a man she had known 15 years, who had the freedom of her dressing room as few others in this company enjoyed, who paced these wings alone during every performance of the final act on the nights. He told me himself that a scene troubled him, which is to say, on every night that his own play reached its final, most personal moment. A man who wrote, 11 months ago, a story of a debt 30 years old, finally collected, and who told me himself, standing exactly where you are seated now, Monsieur Wren, that no coincidence in the theatre is ever quite so elegant as it first appears. Cornelius Wren did not move. I did not understand at first why a playwright should say such a thing to the man investigating a death that had occurred within his own play. But it is, I think, the oldest weakness of the artist, the need, however dangerous, to have his construction admired, even by an audience of one, even by a detective who is not yet certain he is looking at a confession. You told me the truth that night, monsieur, dressed as observation. You did not write a play about revenge. You built, over 11 months, a play that was one, a private theatre within a public one, in which Mademoiselle Deveraux would spend 400 performances speaking words you had written for the express purpose of making her rehearse, unknowingly, the very debt she owed you. You have no proof of any of this, Wren said quietly, though his voice had lost the dry irony it had carried the night before. Not yet the proof a court requires, monsieur, though I think Inspector Japp's officers will find it, once they know where to look, in the correspondence between yourself and a certain small theatre in Islington 15 years ago, and in whatever became of a young actress there whose part, and whose prospects, Mademoiselle Deveraux is said to have taken for her own on her way to becoming somebody at all. I do not yet know her name. I think you will tell us, in time, though I suspect it will cost you a great deal to do so, a great deal more, perhaps, than it has cost you to plan the rest of this so carefully. For a long moment, Wren said nothing at all, and when he spoke, it was not to deny it, but with the strange, terrible calm of a man setting down a weight he had carried so long he had almost forgotten its shape. Her name was Eleanor. She had more talent than Marguerite ever possessed, and considerably less appetite for what it cost to use it. Marguerite took the part that should have been hers, and the confidence along with it, and Eleanor never acted again, and died some years later, in circumstances I will not trouble this company with tonight. I wrote this play for her, Mr. Poirot. I gave her name to the woman Marguerite would play, Eleanor Ashworth, patient, wronged, finally repaid. I thought it would be enough simply to watch Marguerite speak those words, night after night, and know, though she never did, exactly what she was rehearsing. And then, 3 weeks ago, she came to my dressing room and told me she knew. She had found, I think, some paper of mine I had been careless enough to leave where she might see it, and she wept, and told me she meant to leave the stage forever, in penance, and asked my forgiveness. And you did not give it, said Poirot quietly. I had waited 15 years to give it, Mr. Poirot. I found, in the end, I did not have it in me to hand it over so easily as that. Not for a woman who had simply decided, at the very last, that quitting quietly would settle a debt 15 years overdue. Some debts, I think, are not meant to be forgiven. They are meant to be collected. The silence that followed held the whole company still, and it was Japp, at last, who rose and spoke the words that ended it, formal and final as any curtain line, while Ada Grigg wept quietly into Lily Prentice's shoulder, and Julian Rain stared at the chalk-washed boards as though seeing, for the first time, the play he had performed in without ever once suspecting its true final act. Poirot walked out afterward into a London gone grey, with early morning, Levy silent and thoughtful beside him, and stood for a moment looking back at the darkened front of the Savoy, its marquee still bearing, in letters soon to be taken down, the name of a play that had told the truth to 1,100 people every night for 11 months, and been believed, by every one of them, to be only a story. A very sad ending, Poirot, Levy said at last. A very human one, mon ami, Poirot corrected gently, adjusting his hat against the morning chill. Which is, I have found, very often the saddest kind there is.